There are moments in history when human invention reshapes not just warfare, but the very imagination of an age. One such moment came in the mid-19th century, when the age of wooden sailing fleets, which had ruled the seas for centuries, was suddenly confronted by something entirely new: the ironclad warship. These vessels, their hulls clad in sheets of iron and their engines driven by steam, marked the first decisive break with the traditions of the age of sail. To sailors who had known only oak and canvas, they appeared almost monstrous. Black, smoke-belching fortresses that moved with unnatural power, impervious to cannon fire that once shattered wooden sides with ease. The coming of the ironclad was not merely the story of a new type of ship, it was the beginning of a new epoch. It signaled the decline of centuries-old naval traditions and the arrival of modern naval warfare. The ironclad was the ancestor of the battleship, the cruiser, and ultimately every steel warship that plows the oceans today. This is the story of those ships, their origins, their struggles in battle, their triumphs and disasters, and the legacy they left behind as the harbingers of the Iron Age of the fleet. Historical context. To understand the rise of the ironclad, one must first consider the world that preceded it. For centuries, naval warfare had been governed by the great sailing ships of the line, wooden leviathans bristling with cannons, arranged in ordered broadsides, fighting battles decided by maneuver and gunnery in the open sea. By the early 19th century, this system had reached its peak. The Napoleonic Wars had showcased the might of these ships with battles like Trafalgar, 1805, demonstrating the deadly power of disciplined fleets under sail. Yet even at that time, new forces were stirring beneath the surface of tradition. Steam power was already beginning to challenge the supremacy of sail. By the 1820s and 1830s, steam-driven paddle ships had appeared, at first as transports and auxiliaries. Their engines gave them independence from the wind, but their exposed paddles were vulnerable in battle, and many doubted that such ungainly vessels could ever replace the majestic ships of the line. At the same time, artillery itself was evolving. The invention of explosive shells by a French artillery officer, Henri-Joseph Péchens, in the 1820s meant that a single hit could ignite a wooden hull and send even the largest frigate to the bottom in flames. Suddenly, the proud timber walls of Navis seemed fragile. The Crimean War, 1853 to 1856, offered the first real test of these innovations. During the war, the French and British navires introduced floating batteries clad in iron to withstand Russian coastal defenses. At the Battle of Kinburn in 1855, these iron-covered platforms shrugged off heavy fire and silenced Russian forts with devastating bombardment. Observers around the world took note. Here was proof that iron armor could defy traditional cannon. In the aftermath, naval architects in France, Britain, and beyond began to imagine something new. Not just floating batteries, but full, seagoing warships sheathed in iron. France was the first to act, launching La Gloire in 1859, the world's first true ocean-going ironclad. Britain quickly answered with HMS Warrior in 1860, a ship larger, faster, and more powerful, constructed entirely of iron. Across the Atlantic, events unfolded in parallel. The American Civil War, 1861 to 1865, provided the crucible in which ironclads proved themselves in dramatic fashion. The clash between USS Monitor and CSS Virginia in 1862 was unlike any battle seen before. Two armored warships trading blows at close range, immune to the weapons that once decided the fate of fleets. The message was clear. The age of wooden navies was ending. The age of iron and steam had begun. The French pioneer, La Gloire. In 1859, France astonished the world by launching La Gloire, the first true sea-going ironclad warship. She was not built entirely of iron, but rather a traditional wooden hull sheathed in thick wrought iron plates. Yet to contemporaries, she was revolutionary. Naval architect Stanislas Dupuy-de-Lôme designed her as a response to the growing threat of explosive shells. Her iron armor was over 4 inches thick, enough to repel conventional naval guns. Beneath the armor, she carried 36 rifled muzzle-loading guns along her broadside. At 5,600 tons and 83 meters long, she combined the silhouette of a traditional frigate with the protection of an armored fortress. When La Gloire entered service, she made every unarmored warship afloat seem instantly vulnerable. France had taken a bold step into the future. Britain's answer, HMS Warrior. Not to be outdone, Britain, guardian of the world's largest navy, responded with something even more formidable. HMS Warrior, launched in 1860, was the first iron-hulled armored warship. Unlike La Gloire, she was built entirely of iron, not wood. She was enormous for her day, 9,200 tons, 127 meters long, and capable of reaching 40 knots under steam power. Her armor belt was 4.5 inches thick, backed by 18 inches of teak, providing resilience against shot and shell alike. Armed with 40 guns and powered by a single screw propeller, she could also spread an enormous spread of sails, blending old traditions with new technology. The Warrior was a symbol of British industrial might. She was not only a ship of war, but a declaration to the world that Britain would remain the master of the seas in the age of iron. Across the Atlantic, the birth of Virginia and Monitor. While Europe experimented with armored frigates, the United States found itself suddenly in need of innovation when civil war erupted in 1861. The Confederacy, desperate to break the Union's naval blockade, salvaged the burnt hulk of the frigate Merrimac and transformed her into an ironclad monster. Renamed the CSS Virginia, she was covered with sloping iron plates, bristling with 10 guns and fitted with a ram on her bow. When she steamed into Hampton Roads in March 1862, she destroyed 2 Union wooden warships with terrifying ease. Cannonballs bounced harmlessly from her iron skin. For the Union fleet, the wooden age was over in a single afternoon. But the North had an answer of its own. Designed by the eccentric Swedish engineer John Ericsson, the USS Monitor was a radical creation. A low, flat hull with almost no profile above the waterline, dominated by a single revolving turret. The turret contained 2 11-inch Dahlgren guns, which could rotate to fire in any direction, a complete departure from the broadside tradition of centuries. Her construction was rushed, completed in just 100 days, and her appearance was so unusual that many doubted she could even sail. Yet in March 1862, Monitor met Virginia in battle. For hours, the 2 ironclads pounded one another in a stalemate that electrified the world. The spread of innovation. The news spread quickly. From Paris to London, from St. Petersburg to Tokyo, naval observers realized that the wooden fleets lying in harbor were now obsolete. Within a few short years, every major naval power began building ironclads, experimenting with hull shapes, turret systems, rams, and steam engines. Ironclads took many forms. Some retained traditional masts and sails, others relied solely on steam. Some, like Britain's turret ships, HMS Devastation and HMS Dreadnought, 1870s, abandoned sails altogether and embraced armored turrets as the future. What began as improvised experiments in France and America soon became a global race to master the new technology. The ironclad revolution was unstoppable. Dimensions and displacement. The earliest ironclads varied greatly in size depending on their origin and purpose. La Gloire, for example, displaced about 5,600 tons and measured 83 meters in length, still close to the size of a traditional wooden frigate. HMS Warrior, by contrast, was a leap forward, 9,200 tons, 127 meters long with a beam of 18 meters. She dwarfed almost any wooden warship afloat. In the United States, the Civil War ironclads were smaller but more specialized. The CSS Virginia, converted from a burned frigate, displaced about 4,500 tons, while the USS Monitor was far lighter at 987 tons, but with a radically different silhouette, barely rising above the waterline, her turret the only prominent feature. This variation showed that the term ironclad encompassed many designs, from ocean-going armored frigates to squat riverine monitors. Armor. The defining feature of every ironclad was her armor. La Gloire's 4 7-inch iron plates could shrug off traditional round shot, while HMS Warrior's belt of 4 5-inch iron backed by thick teak was nearly impenetrable to contemporary guns. In America, Virginia had 4 inches of sloped iron armor, while Monitor's revolving turret carried 8 inches of armor, thick enough to withstand repeated pounding from her Confederate rival. The principle was clear. Wood was vulnerable, iron could defy destruction. Armor thickness varied with national doctrines, but every new warship carried more plating, heavier bolts, and thicker protective decks. Armament ironclads also redefined naval firepower. Broadside ironclads like La Gloire and Warrior mounted dozens of guns along their flanks, echoing the traditions of wooden fleets but with more powerful rifled artillery. The American monitors abandoned the broadside entirely. Their revolving turrets could train a small number of massive guns in any direction, a revolutionary concept that would later define the battleship. Rams also returned to fashion. Naval theorists, observing how Virginia sank the USS Cumberland with a ram, believed that armored ships might once again settle battles by ramming rather than gunnery. The diversity of weapons showed a world still experimenting with the future of naval combat. Propulsion and speed. All ironclads relied primarily on steam engines, though many early vessels also carried full sailing rigs for long-distance cruising. Warrior, for example, could steam at 40 knots under power, but also set 48,400 square feet of sail when needed. The USS Monitor, by contrast, had no sails at all, relying entirely on her twin steam engines, though she was relatively slow at about 6 knots. This dependence on coal limited her endurance, but demonstrated the shift away from the wind. As ironclad technology advanced, sails were gradually abandoned. By the 1870s, new classes of turret ships and central battery ships relied fully on steam, making them truly modern machines. Crews and life on-board ironclads required large crews to operate both their guns and their complex machinery. HMS Warrior carried about 700 men. La Gloire carried around 570. The USS Monitor, much smaller, carried 60 officers and men. Life aboard an ironclad was harsh. The interior was dark, hot, and often filled with coal dust and smoke from the boilers. In battle, the confined iron spaces became deafening echo chambers where every shot reverberated. Yet for the sailors who served on them, these ships represented the cutting edge of naval warfare. Innovations. The ironclad era was marked by constant innovation. Rotating turrets, first proven by Monitor, allowed guns to cover a 360-degree arc. Armored citadels, or central batteries, concentrated firepower in heavily protected sections. Iron hull construction, pioneered by Warrior, allowed larger, stronger ships than wooden frames ever could. Explosive shells became the standard ammunition, forcing armor and gun designs to evolve in tandem. Every ironclad was, in some sense, an experiment, part tradition, part innovation, each pointing toward the battleships of the 20th century. The American Civil War, 1861 to 1865. The crucible in which ironclads first proved themselves was the American Civil War. The Union blockade of southern ports was strangling the Confederacy, and the South's answer was the ironclad CSS Virginia. In March 1862, she steamed into Hampton Roads and tore through 2 Union wooden frigates. Cannon fire bounced off her angled iron sides as if they were pebbles thrown against stone. Yet the Union had its own answer, the USS Monitor. The 2 ironclads met on March 9, 1862, in a clash that stunned the world. For hours they circled, firing at point-blank range, their shells smashing into armor but failing to destroy. Neither could sink the other. The battle ended in stalemate, but the message was unmistakable. Wooden warships were obsolete. The Union quickly built a fleet of Monitor-type vessels, shallow-draft turret ships ideal for river and coastal operations. They supported assaults along the Mississippi and in harbors from Charleston to New Orleans. The Confederacy, lacking resources, built only a handful of ironclads, often cobbled together from old hulls. Still, these ships forced the Union to respect their power, tying down fleets and shaping strategy. By the end of the war, dozens of ironclads had fought, proving beyond doubt that the future belonged to armored steamships. European rivalries. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Europe entered an arms race of ironclads. After France's Gloire and Britain's HMS Warrior, both nations rapidly expanded their fleets. Each new ship was larger, faster, and more heavily armored than the last. Britain built a whole series of ironclad frigates and turret ships, while France answered with central battery designs that concentrated firepower amidships. Both powers deployed these ships to their global empires, from the Mediterranean to the Far East, projecting an image of unstoppable modern power. The 1860s also saw ironclads tested in regional conflicts. In 1866, during the Battle of Lissa between Italy and Austria, ironclads clashed in the first fleet action of the new age. The Austrian flagship Erzherzog Ferdinand Max rammed and sank the Italian Re d'Italia, proving that armor and steam had revived the ancient tactic of ramming. Though the battle was chaotic, it showed the world that ironclads could decide wars at sea. The Far East and beyond ironclads also reached Asia, where Western navies brought them as symbols of modernity. Japan, then emerging from centuries of isolation, studied these ships closely. By the 1870s, the new Imperial Japanese Navy had acquired ironclads of its own, laying the groundwork for its rise as a naval power. Russia, too, built ironclads for the Baltic and Black Seas, while Spain, Germany, and the Ottoman Empire acquired their own armored fleets. No major power could afford to be left behind. Colonial expeditions beyond great battles, ironclads served in expeditions around the world. British ironclads bombarded fortresses along the African coast, enforced control in the Mediterranean, and appeared in Asian waters to remind local rulers of imperial reach. Their iron armor made them invulnerable to most shore batteries, giving them dominance in gunboat diplomacy. French ironclads cruised to Indochina and North Africa, where they supported colonial campaigns. Even smaller powers like Denmark and Sweden constructed ironclads for coastal defense, recognizing that wooden navies no longer offered protection. The global symbol of power. By the 1870s and 1880s, ironclads were everywhere, in the Atlantic, the Pacific, the Mediterranean, and the Baltic. They became the visible sign of a nation's status. To possess ironclads was to be modern, powerful, and respected. No longer were fleets of majestic wooden ships the measure of strength. The new age demanded armored hulls, rifled guns, and steam propulsion. The ironclad was not only a warship but also a political statement, a floating fortress that carried the pride of its nation across the seas. Hampton Roads, 1862. Monitor versus Virginia. The first clash of ironclads remains the most famous. On March 8, 1862, CSS Virginia destroyed 2 Union wooden warships at Hampton Roads, sending shockwaves through naval circles. The next day, the USS Monitor arrived, For hours, the two armored giants circled each other, exchanging thunderous broadsides. Cannonballs ricocheted off iron plating, sparks flew, and smoke enveloped the scene. For the first time, warships seemed immune to gunfire. Though the battle ended in a draw, it marked the end of wooden navies. Every admiral in Europe and America took notice. The Battle of Lissa, 1866. Return of the Ram. In the Adriatic Sea, the Italian and Austrian navies met in the first major ironclad fleet battle. Despite Italy's numerical superiority, confusion and poor leadership doomed their effort. Austrian Admiral Wilhelm von Tegethoff led his ships in daring close-quarter maneuvers, using his flagship Erzherzog Ferdinand Max to ram and sink the Italian ironclad Re d'Italia. The spectacle of one ironclad sinking another by ramming electrified naval strategists. For decades after, designers built ships with reinforced rams, convinced that future battles would be decided at knife's edge. Though later developments proved otherwise, Lissa showed that ironclads were not just fortresses, they were predators. The Franco-Prussian War, 1870 to 1871. The ironclads that never fought. During the Franco-Prussian War, France deployed one of the most modern ironclad fleets in the world. Yet despite their presence, the French Navy played little role in the war. Blockades and cautious strategy kept these formidable vessels from meeting their German adversaries. Still, their very existence loomed large, a reminder that ironclads had become indispensable to great power rivalry. The bombardment of Alexandria, 1882, Empire in action. By the 1880s, ironclads were not only weapons of war, but also tools of imperial power. In July 1882, British ironclads anchored off Alexandria, Egypt, to suppress a nationalist uprising. Their guns opened fire, hurling explosive shells into the city and reducing fortifications to rubble. The bombardment demonstrated how armored warships could project power far beyond Europe, enforcing empire through sheer destructive capability. The Sino-Japanese War, 1894 to 1895. The rise of a new power. In East Asia, ironclads played a key role in Japan's rise as a naval power. At the Battle of the Yalu River in 1894, the Japanese fleet, equipped with modern warships, including armored cruisers and ironclads, clashed with China's Beiyang fleet. The result was a decisive Japanese victory, establishing Japan as a new force in world naval affairs, and proving that mastery of modern ships could overturn centuries of tradition. The Spanish-American War, 1898. The end of the era. By the end of the 19th century, ironclads were giving way to pre-dreadnought battleships. Yet their spirit lingered. In the Spanish-American War, the remnants of Spain's once proud armored fleet met destruction at the hands of the United States Navy. The battles at Manila Bay and Santiago de Cuba showed that armored fleets could still fall quickly before superior firepower and tactics. These moments marked both the triumph and the twilight of the ironclad age. In little more than 4 decades, ironclads had evolved from experimental hybrids to global symbols of naval strength, and then to obsolescence as new technologies emerged. A symbol of transformation. The ironclad was not merely a new type of warship, it was a symbol of a world in transition. In less than a generation, centuries of naval tradition built on wood, sail, and broadside cannon were swept aside. For sailors who had grown up climbing rigging and trimming sails, the sight of iron hulls belching smoke was both awe-inspiring and unsettling. The ironclad stood for modernity, for industry, and for the unstoppable advance of technology. In national pride for France, La Gloire was a point of national prestige, the ship that showed Europe that French industry could lead. For Britain, HMS Warrior was not just a warship, but a floating statement of empire, reassuring the nation that the Royal Navy remained supreme. In the United States, the duel of Monitor and Virginia became legend, taught in classrooms and immortalized in paintings. The strange little monitor entered American folklore as the cheese box on a raft, a humble yet ingenious defender of the Union. In the South, Virginia became a proud, if doomed, symbol of Confederate ingenuity. In literature and art, the dramatic forms of ironclads quickly found their way into the imagination of artists and writers. Newspapers of the 1860s carried woodcuts of the Monitor Virginia duel that spread across the world. Painters captured scenes of black smoke, iron silhouettes, and seas churned by steam-driven giants. Writers, too, seized upon the ironclad as a metaphor for progress and power. In Jules Verne's time, the armored warship became an icon of modern science and the dangers of unchecked invention. In naval literature, the ironclad often represented the end of romance at sea, the replacement of canvas and wind with smoke and iron. Preservation and rediscovery. Some ironclads were preserved as museums, allowing later generations to step aboard the ships that had once seemed invincible. HMS Warrior, after decades of neglect, was restored and today rests at Portsmouth as a reminder of Britain's naval heritage. Visitors can walk her iron decks, peer into her gun decks, and imagine the power she once embodied. The wrecks of others became underwater monuments. Divers and archaeologists explored sites like Hampton Roads, where fragments of the Monitor were raised and displayed. Each rivet and plate recovered was a fragment of history, linking the present to the moment when iron first challenged wood. Legacy in naval design. Above all, the ironclad left behind a legacy of innovation. The revolving turret of the Monitor set the stage for the battleship's great guns of the 20th century. The lessons of armor, propulsion, and centralized firepower shaped naval doctrine for generations. Though ironclads were soon outpaced by steel-hulled pre-dreadnoughts and later dreadnoughts, their spirit lived on. Every armored warship that followed owed its ancestry to those experimental vessels of the 1860s. In collective memory, today, the word ironclad still evokes strength, resilience, and reliability. In language, an ironclad rule is one that cannot be broken. In history, the ships remain a vivid reminder of the moment when human ingenuity, pressed by war and ambition, reshaped the oceans forever. The story of the ironclads is the story of change, sudden, dramatic, and irreversible. In the span of only a few decades, the world's navies passed from the romance of wind and timber to the era of smoke, steel, and industrial might. The ironclad was the bridge between ages, born from the lessons of wooden fleets and the destructive force of explosive shells, yet pointing firmly toward the future of battleships, cruisers, and modern naval warfare. They were ships of experiment and ambition. Some, like La Gloire and Warrior, were designed to showcase national pride, to tell rivals that their builders stood at the forefront of progress. Others, like Monitor and Virginia, were improvised and urgent, forged in the fires of civil war. Yet whether carefully planned or hastily built, each ironclad carried the same truth. The old order of wooden warships could not survive. Their service was not always long, nor their battles many. Yet their influence was vast. Every admiral and shipwright in the late 19th century understood that naval power now depended on armor and steam. From the Adriatic to Hampton Roads, from Alexandria to the Yellow Sea, ironclads altered strategy, inspired fear, and redrew the balance of power. Beyond the technical and military, the ironclad also reshaped imagination. To the people who saw them, they looked like beasts of iron, unnatural, invincible, a vision of the modern age taking command of the seas. For some, they symbolized safety and pride. For others, they were the harbingers of a new, more destructive kind of war. Today, most ironclads are gone, their rivets rusted, and their hulls long since scrapped. A few, like HMS Warrior, survive as silent witnesses to their time. Others rest beneath the waves, their outlines softened by sand and sea life, yet still telling their story to those who dive to see them. But even in memory, they endure. The word ironclad itself has become part of our language, meaning something strong, unbreakable, certain. And in the history of the seas, the ironclads will always stand as the ships that changed everything. When we look back at them now, we see not only warships of iron and steam, but also symbols of human ambition, the drive to innovate, to adapt, and to master the elements. They remind us that every age believes its creations to be invincible, and that every age, in turn, is overtaken by the next. The age of the ironclads was brief, but its impact was eternal.